The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Elmwood Park, painting the lush green grass in hues of amber and gold. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak trees, their branches reaching skyward like gnarled fingers. Reverend James, a man whose presence commanded respect and radiated warmth, sought solace amidst this tranquil setting. He wasn't a man who needed grand cathedrals or imposing sanctuaries to connect with his faith. The natural world, with its quiet beauty and boundless expanse, served as his preferred chapel. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, his gait measured and deliberate. His dark suit, usually crisp and starched for Sunday services, was slightly rumpled from a long day spent counseling parishioners and tending to the needs of his congregation. He wasn't burdened by the weight of his responsibilities, however. Instead, he carried them with the grace of a seasoned shepherd guiding his flock. His face, etched with the lines of wisdom and compassion, held a peaceful serenity that reflected his inner strength. He chose a spot beneath the largest oak, its sprawling branches offering a canopy of shade. The ground was soft and yielding beneath his worn leather shoes. He settled onto a small, worn patch of grass, his posture relaxed yet reverent. He closed his eyes, his hands clasped together, and breathed deeply, the scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass filling his lungs. The sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of children playing, faded into a gentle background hum, their presence not intrusive but a reminder of the world beyond his quiet sanctuary. Reverend James wasn't reciting memorized prayers or following a rigid liturgy. His communion with God was a personal, intimate affair, a conversation whispered on the breeze. He poured out his heart, sharing his joys and concerns, his hopes and anxieties. He prayed for his congregation, for their struggles and triumphs, for their healing and their growth. He prayed for the city, for its inhabitants, for its leaders, for its future. He prayed for peace, for justice, for understanding. His prayers were simple, heartfelt, and deeply personal. He wasn't oblivious to the world around him. He could hear the faint sounds of life continuing beyond his quiet haven. The laughter of children, the distant bark of a dog, the rhythmic squeak of a swing set. He was aware of the occasional passerby, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path that wound its way through the park. He felt a sense of connection to them, a silent acknowledgement of their shared humanity. He was a part of this community, woven into its fabric, and his prayers encompassed all who inhabited it. He remained in his quiet communion for a considerable time, lost in the rhythm of his breath, the ebb and flow of his thoughts, the gentle sway of the branches overhead. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting longer shadows and painting the clouds in fiery shades of orange and red. The air grew cooler, carrying with it the promise of an approaching evening. He felt a sense of peace and renewal, a quiet strength that settled deep within his soul. He opened his eyes, a gentle smile playing on his lips, and prepared to return to the world beyond his temporary sanctuary. He stood, stretched his limbs, and took a deep breath of the crisp evening air, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The park, once a place of quiet solitude, now felt like a place of renewed strength and purpose. He was ready. He was prepared. He was Reverend James, and he was ready to serve. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose life was as rigidly structured as the rows of neatly manicured hedges in his front yard, considered Elmwood Park his personal domain. He frequented the park daily, his routine as predictable as the sunrise. He walked the same path, sat on the same bench, and fed the same pigeons. He valued order, predictability, and the comfort of the familiar. Anything that disrupted his meticulously crafted routine grated on his nerves. Today, however, something was different, something unexpected. He spotted a black man sitting beneath the large oak tree, his head bowed, his hands clasped. Mr. Abernathy, a man who held onto outdated beliefs with the tenacity of a bulldog, immediately grew suspicious. He'd seen this man before, Reverend James, the pastor of the predominantly black church on the other side of town. But seeing him here, in his park, in such a secluded spot, fueled a simmering unease within him. Mr. Abernathy wasn't overtly racist. He wouldn't shout slurs or engage in blatant acts of discrimination. His prejudice was more subtle, more insidious, a quiet distrust, a deeply ingrained suspicion of anyone who didn't fit neatly into his narrow worldview. He saw the Reverend's quiet prayer as something sinister, something out of place. He couldn't articulate why, but the image of a black man alone in the park, seemingly engaged in some private ritual, triggered a primal fear within him. He watched from a distance, his gaze fixed on the Reverend. He observed the way the Reverend's shoulders moved with each breath, the slight tremor in his hands. He interpreted these actions not as signs of prayerful devotion, but as evidence of clandestine activity. He imagined the Reverend whispering coded messages, planning some nefarious scheme. His imagination, fueled by prejudice and a lack of understanding, conjured up scenarios that had no basis in reality. Mr. Abernathy's discomfort grew with each passing minute. The peaceful setting, which usually brought him a sense of calm, now felt unsettling. The gentle rustling of leaves sounded like whispers, the distant sounds of children playing like conspiratorial murmurs. His carefully constructed sense of order and predictability was shattered by the presence of the Reverend, a disruption he couldn't reconcile. He found himself clutching his walking stick tighter, his knuckles white. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against the tranquility of the park. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal urge to act, to restore the order he felt was being violated. The Reverend's quiet prayer, an act of faith and devotion, was perceived by Mr. Abernathy as a threat, an intrusion into his carefully curated world. His thoughts raced, fueled by suspicion and fear. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that this seemingly harmless scene held a darker, more sinister meaning. He couldn't articulate the source of his unease, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. He knew he had to do something, to intervene, to restore the sense of order and security that had been so violently disrupted by the presence of the Reverend in his park. The seed of prejudice, long dormant, had finally sprouted, its roots twisting and growing, choking out any sense of reason or empathy. He made a decision born not of logic or understanding, but of fear and ingrained bias. He would act. He would intervene. He would call the police. With trembling hands, Mr. Abernathy pulled out his cell phone. His fingers, usually steady and precise, fumbled with the device, his agitation betraying his carefully cultivated composure. He located the emergency number, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He hesitated for a moment, a flicker of doubt momentarily piercing his certainty. But the feeling of unease, the unsettling disruption to his carefully constructed routine, quickly overwhelmed his hesitation. He had to act. He pressed the button, the shrill ring cutting through the afternoon calm. He waited, each second stretching into an eternity, his anxiety growing with each passing ring. Finally, a voice answered, crisp and professional, breaking through his rising panic. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure, but his voice trembled slightly as he began to speak. "Yes, hello," he began, his voice strained. "I'm calling to report suspicious activity in Elmwood Park." He paused, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. He tried to sound calm, authoritative, but his voice betrayed his inner turmoil. He could feel his face flushing, his palms sweating. "Suspicious activity?" The operator responded, her voice neutral, professional. "Can you please elaborate?" Mr. Abernathy hesitated again, struggling to articulate his vague feelings of unease. He couldn't explain the source of his suspicion, the deep-seated prejudice that fueled his fear. He could only describe what he saw, a black man alone, in a secluded part of the park, his head bowed, his hands clasped. He painted a picture of secrecy and clandestine activity, embellishing the details with his own anxieties and misinterpretations. "There's a man," he stammered, "a black man sitting under the big oak tree. He's been there for a while, just sitting, doing nothing. It looks suspicious." He paused, searching for the right words, the words that would convince the operator of the validity of his concerns. He felt a surge of guilt, a fleeting moment of doubt, but it was quickly overshadowed by his ingrained prejudice. He continued, his voice gaining confidence as he elaborated on his unfounded suspicions. He described the man's posture, the way he moved, the way he looked around, twisting innocent actions into evidence of nefarious intent. He spoke of hidden agendas, secret meetings, and potential threats to the community, creating a narrative that had no basis in reality. He painted a picture of danger and intrigue, a scene plucked from his own troubled imagination. The operator listened patiently, her voice remaining calm and professional. She asked clarifying questions, attempting to gather more information. Mr. Abernathy answered, expanding on his accusations, adding details that weren't there, fueling the flames of his unfounded fears. He painted a picture of a menacing figure, a threat to the peace and tranquility of Elmwood Park, a man whose very presence was a cause for alarm. He finished his call, feeling a strange mixture of relief and unease. He had reported the suspicious activity. He had done his civic duty. He had restored order to his world. But a nagging doubt lingered in the back of his mind, a seed of uncertainty that threatened to undermine his self-satisfaction. He had acted on his fears, on his prejudices, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had done something wrong. But that feeling was quickly overshadowed by the relief of having restored his sense of order and control. The call was made. The police were on their way. He had done his part, or so he thought. The arrival of the police car shattered the afternoon tranquility of Elmwood Park. Its siren, a jarring intrusion into the peaceful atmosphere, sent a ripple of unease through the park's occupants. Children stopped their games, their laughter replaced by a nervous silence. Dogs, usually boisterous and playful, whimpered and cowered, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Even the birds ceased their chirping, their usual melodies replaced by an unnerving stillness. Two officers, Officer Miller and Officer Davies, emerged from the vehicle. Both were seasoned officers, well known and respected within the community. Officer Miller, a tall, imposing figure with a kind smile, was known for his calm demeanor and his ability to de-escalate tense situations. Officer Davies, shorter and more compact, possessed a sharp wit and an uncanny ability to read people. They were an effective team, their contrasting personalities complementing each other. They approached Reverend James cautiously, their weapons drawn but held at their sides. They were aware of the call they had received, the vague accusations of suspicious activity. But they also knew Reverend James, a pillar of the community, a man whose reputation preceded him. They approached him with a mixture of caution and respect. Reverend James, Officer Miller said, his voice calm and reassuring. We received a call about some suspicious activity in the park. Is everything all right? Reverend James, initially startled by the sudden arrival of the police, quickly composed himself. He recognized the officers, their faces familiar from community events and outreach programs. He understood their cautious approach, their need to investigate the situation. He responded with a calm, measured tone. Officers, he replied, his voice even and steady. I was simply praying. I apologize if my presence caused any alarm. Officer Miller exchanged a glance with Officer Davies. They both knew Reverend James' reputation. He was a man of peace, a man of faith, a man who dedicated his life to serving his community. The accusations seemed absurd, completely out of character for the man they knew. They questioned him briefly, their tone respectful and understanding. They asked about his presence in the park, the reason for his quiet solitude. Reverend James explained his routine, his need for quiet reflection, his practice of prayer in nature. He answered their questions honestly and openly, his responses clear and concise. Officer Miller and Officer Davies listened intently, their initial suspicions slowly dissolving. They observed his calm demeanor, his peaceful countenance. They sensed his sincerity, his genuine nature. The accusations, which seemed so serious over the phone, now felt flimsy, unfounded. They turned their attention to Mr. Abernathy, who watched from a distance, his face a mask of apprehension. He had witnessed the interaction between the officers and Reverend James, his initial sense of triumph slowly turning to unease. He saw the respect the officers showed the Reverend, the way they listened intently, the way they dismissed his concerns without outright confrontation. Officer Davies approached Mr. Abernathy, his tone firm but polite. He asked him about his call, his reasons for reporting suspicious activity. Mr. Abernathy, caught off guard, stammered and hesitated, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling under the weight of the officer's scrutiny. He tried to reiterate his concerns, but his words lacked conviction, his explanations unconvincing. The officers, having already spoken to Reverend James, were unconvinced by Mr. Abernathy's claims. They understood the situation, the underlying prejudice that fueled his unfounded accusations. They handled the situation with a mixture of firmness and understanding, ensuring that Mr. Abernathy understood the gravity of his actions without resorting to harshness or condemnation. The situation was resolved, but the seeds of misunderstanding and prejudice remained, waiting for the right moment to sprout again. The park, once again, fell silent, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. Officer Davies, a seasoned veteran with a keen eye for human behavior, had seen enough. Mr. Abernathy's nervous fidgeting, his evasive answers, and the stark contrast between his accusations and the Reverend's calm demeanor spoke volumes. He understood the situation wasn't about a crime. It was about prejudice, a deeply ingrained bias that had warped Mr. Abernathy's perception of reality. "Sir," Officer Davies said, his voice firm but measured, "we understand your concern, but based on our conversation with Reverend James, it seems there was a misunderstanding. He was simply praying, engaging in a private act of devotion. There's no evidence of any criminal activity." Mr. Abernathy's face fell. His carefully constructed narrative, the foundation of his accusations, was crumbling before his eyes. He had expected the officers to side with him, to validate his fears, to confirm his suspicions. Instead, they had seen through his thinly veiled prejudice, exposing the baselessness of his claims. Officer Miller, ever the diplomat, stepped in to de-escalate the situation. "Sir," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "we appreciate you bringing this to our attention. It's important for citizens to report any concerns they have. However, in this case, it seems there was a misinterpretation of events. Reverend James was simply engaging in a peaceful act of prayer. There's no reason to believe any crime has been committed." He paused, giving Mr. Abernathy a chance to respond, but the man remained silent, his face a mixture of shame and embarrassment. The officers understood the underlying prejudice fueling his actions, but they also recognized the importance of addressing the situation with sensitivity and understanding. They weren't there to judge or condemn. They were there to resolve the misunderstanding and restore peace. Officer Davies continued, his tone shifting from firm to empathetic. "Sometimes, sir, our perceptions can be skewed by our own biases. It's important to remember that not everyone shares our perspectives or interprets situations in the same way. We encourage you to consider this in the future before making assumptions or reporting potentially unfounded concerns." He paused again, allowing his words to sink in. He wasn't lecturing Mr. Abernathy. He was educating him, gently guiding him toward a more nuanced understanding of the world. He understood the power of ingrained prejudice and the difficulty of overcoming deeply held beliefs. But he also believed in the power of education and understanding. Mr. Abernathy remained silent, his gaze fixed on the ground. He was ashamed, embarrassed, and deeply regretful. His carefully constructed world, a world built on order and predictability, had been shaken to its core. His assumptions, his prejudices had been exposed, leaving him feeling vulnerable and exposed. The officers, having resolved the misunderstanding, thanked Mr. Abernathy for his cooperation and prepared to leave. They reiterated their appreciation for his concern, while subtly emphasizing the importance of avoiding hasty judgments based on unfounded assumptions. They left Mr. Abernathy standing alone in the park, his carefully constructed reality shattered, his prejudices laid bare. As they walked back to their patrol car, Officer Miller turned to Officer Davies. "Another one bites the dust," he said, a hint of weariness in his voice. "It's always the same story. Fear, misunderstanding, and a whole lot of prejudice. Sometimes, I wish we could just fix it all." Officer Davies nodded in agreement. "We can't fix it all, Miller," he replied, "but we can make a difference, one case at a time. We can educate, we can understand, and we can help people see beyond their own biases. That's all we can do. They got into their car, leaving Mr. Abernathy alone with his thoughts, his shame, and the lingering weight of his unfounded accusations. The park, once filled with tension, slowly returned to its peaceful tranquility. The misunderstanding was resolved, but the underlying issues remained, waiting for another opportunity to surface. The following days were a blur for Mr. Abernathy. The encounter in Elmwood Park, the shame of his unfounded accusations, the officer's quiet rebuke, it all weighed heavily on his mind. He replayed the scene over and over, each iteration intensifying his feelings of regret and self-recrimination. He tried to rationalize his actions, to justify his suspicions, but the truth remained. He had acted out of prejudice, out of fear, out of a deep-seated distrust of anyone who didn't fit neatly into his narrow worldview. He tried to return to his routine, to the comforting predictability of his daily walks and meticulously manicured hedges. But the peace he once found in his routine was gone, replaced by a gnawing unease, a constant reminder of his flawed judgment. The park, once his sanctuary, now felt like a place of shame, a constant reminder of his error. Then the unthinkable happened. His son, Thomas, a bright, energetic boy of 10, fell violently ill. It started with a simple fever, a seemingly innocuous ailment easily dismissed. But the fever quickly escalated, accompanied by a persistent cough and increasing lethargy. Within days, Thomas was confined to his bed, his normally vibrant spirit replaced by a listless weakness. Mr. Abernathy, a man who valued order and control, found himself utterly helpless. He watched his son's condition deteriorate, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The doctors, despite their best efforts, couldn't pinpoint the cause of Thomas's illness. The tests were inconclusive, the prognosis uncertain. The uncertainty, the lack of control, terrified him. He spent sleepless nights by his son's bedside, watching over him, praying for his recovery. He felt a deep sense of helplessness, a stark contrast to his usual self-assured demeanor. His meticulously planned life, his carefully constructed routine, meant nothing in the face of his son's suffering. The fear for his son's well-being intensified his feelings of guilt and regret. The shame of his actions in Elmwood Park seemed insignificant compared to the overwhelming fear for his son's life. The hospital became his new reality, a sterile environment filled with the sounds of beeping machines and hushed whispers. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of anxious waiting, hopeful prayers, and agonizing uncertainty. He watched as his son's condition fluctuated, his small body ravaged by the unseen illness. He felt a profound sense of despair, a crushing weight of helplessness that threatened to consume him. He found himself questioning everything, his values, his beliefs, his actions. The incident in the park, once a source of shame and regret, now seemed insignificant compared to the overwhelming fear for his son's life. He realized the depth of his own prejudice, the way it had clouded his judgment, the way it had led him to act in a manner that was both unjust and unkind. He yearned for a way to make amends, a way to undo the harm he had caused. But more than anything, he prayed for his son's healing, his pleas filled with a desperation he had never known before. The sterile hospital room became his new sanctuary, the beeping machines a constant reminder of his son's fragility and his own profound helplessness. His carefully constructed world had crumbled, leaving him exposed and vulnerable, his heart filled with fear and regret. The weight of his actions, both past and present, pressed down on him, a crushing burden he couldn't escape. He was lost, adrift in a sea of fear and uncertainty, his only hope clinging to the possibility of his son's recovery. News of Thomas's illness spread quickly through the close-knit community. Reverend James, ever attentive to the needs of his parishioners, heard about the boy's critical condition. He knew Mr. Abernathy only vaguely, a distant acquaintance from the occasional community event. He remembered the incident in Elmwood Park, the unfounded accusations, the subsequent misunderstanding. But he also knew the power of faith, the solace it could offer in times of distress. He felt a stirring of compassion, a deep empathy for the family's suffering. He wasn't driven by a desire for reconciliation or a need to make amends. His motivation was purely compassionate. He felt a deep sense of responsibility to offer comfort and support, regardless of past disagreements or misunderstandings. Without hesitation, he decided to visit Thomas in the hospital. He didn't inform Mr. Abernathy beforehand. He wanted his visit to be a gesture of genuine compassion, not a calculated attempt at reconciliation. He felt a deep sense of empathy for the family's suffering, and he wanted to offer comfort and support without any expectation of reciprocation. He arrived at the hospital carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers, a simple gesture of kindness. He found Thomas's room, a small, sterile space filled with the hum of machines and the scent of antiseptic. Mr. Abernathy sat by his son's bedside, his face etched with worry and exhaustion. He looked up as Reverend James entered, his expression a mixture of surprise and apprehension. Reverend James approached cautiously, his demeanor gentle and reassuring. He offered a quiet greeting, his voice soft and respectful. He presented the wildflowers, a simple gesture of kindness that transcended past grievances. Mr. Abernathy accepted the flowers, his expression softening slightly. Reverend James didn't launch into a sermon or offer unsolicited advice. He simply sat beside Mr. Abernathy, offering a silent presence of comfort and support. He understood the weight of the situation, the profound anxiety and fear that filled the room. He offered a silent prayer, a heartfelt plea for Thomas's healing. He spoke softly to Thomas, his voice gentle and soothing. He didn't focus on the illness or the prognosis. He spoke of simple things, the beauty of nature, the joy of childhood, the power of hope. He spoke of faith, not as a rigid doctrine, but as a source of strength and resilience. He spoke of the unwavering love of God, a love that transcended illness and suffering. He spent a considerable time with Mr. Abernathy and Thomas, his presence a calming influence in the tense atmosphere. He didn't preach or judge. He simply offered comfort and support, his empathy bridging the gap created by past misunderstandings. He spoke of faith, not as a rigid doctrine, but as a source of strength and resilience. He spoke of the unwavering love of God, a love that transcended illness and suffering. As he prepared to leave, he placed a comforting hand on Mr. Abernathy's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and understanding. He offered a silent prayer for the boy's recovery, a prayer filled with genuine compassion and empathy. He left the room, leaving behind a sense of peace and hope that had been absent before his arrival. His visit was a simple act of kindness, a gesture of compassion that transcended past grievances, a testament to the power of empathy and the enduring strength of the human spirit. He left the hospital, his heart filled with a sense of purpose, his spirit renewed. He had done what he felt was right, and he knew, deep down, that his actions would have a profound impact on the lives of those he had visited. The sterile white walls of the hospital room seemed to amplify the silence, a silence heavy with anxiety and uncertainty. Thomas lay in his bed, his small body frail and still, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor a constant reminder of his precarious condition. Mr. Abernathy sat beside him, his face etched with worry and exhaustion, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Reverend James, having sat beside them for some time in quiet companionship, felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew words were inadequate, that no amount of comforting phrases could fully alleviate the fear and uncertainty that filled the room. But he also knew the power of prayer, the solace it could offer in times of distress. He gently placed his hand on Thomas's forehead, a silent gesture of comfort and healing. He closed his eyes, his heart filled with a deep compassion for the suffering boy and his distraught father. He began to pray, his voice soft and reverent, his words simple yet profound. He didn't recite a memorized prayer. His words flowed spontaneously from his heart, a heartfelt plea for healing and restoration. He prayed for Thomas's strength, for his resilience, for his ability to fight the illness that ravaged his small body. He prayed for the doctors and nurses, for their wisdom and skill, for their unwavering dedication to their patients. He prayed for Mr. Abernathy, for his courage and strength, for his ability to endure this difficult time. He prayed for the family, for their unity and support, for their unwavering faith in the face of adversity. His prayer wasn't a demand or a negotiation with a higher power. It was a humble request, a heartfelt expression of faith and hope. He acknowledged the uncertainty of the situation, the possibility of both healing and loss. But he also affirmed his belief in the power of faith, the unwavering love of God, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. He prayed for the restoration of health, not just for Thomas's physical well-being, but also for the healing of the emotional wounds that had been inflicted upon the family. He prayed for the mending of broken relationships, the reconciliation of past grievances, the fostering of understanding and compassion. His prayer was a plea for wholeness, for the restoration of both physical and emotional well-being. His voice, though soft, carried a weight of sincerity and conviction. His words resonated not only in the small hospital room, but also in the hearts of those who heard them. Mr. Abernathy, initially apprehensive, found himself drawn into the prayer, his own anxieties momentarily eased by the Reverend's heartfelt plea. He felt a sense of peace and solace, a quiet strength that settled deep within his soul. The prayer wasn't a magical cure. It wasn't a guarantee of healing, but it was a powerful expression of faith, hope, and compassion. It was a reminder of the enduring strength of the human spirit, the ability to find solace and strength in the face of adversity. It was a testament to the power of prayer, not as a means of manipulation or control, but as a heartfelt expression of faith, hope, and love. As the prayer concluded, a sense of peace settled over the room, a quiet calm that replaced the earlier tension and anxiety. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor continued, a constant reminder of Thomas's fragility. But the atmosphere had shifted, the weight of fear and uncertainty momentarily eased by the power of faith and compassion. The prayer had served its purpose, not as a cure, but as a source of strength and hope. The Reverend's visit wasn't a fleeting moment. It left an indelible mark on Mr. Abernathy. He hadn't expected such an act of kindness, such a demonstration of compassion from a man he had so wrongly judged. The encounter challenged his preconceived notions, his ingrained prejudices, shaking the very foundation of his worldview. He had expected anger, resentment, perhaps even condemnation. Instead, he received empathy, understanding, and a profound act of selfless kindness. The Reverend's visit wasn't a calculated attempt at reconciliation. It was a genuine expression of compassion, a gesture that transcended past grievances. Mr. Abernathy watched as Reverend James interacted with his son, his touch gentle, his voice soothing. He saw the genuine concern in the Reverend's eyes, the unwavering compassion in his demeanor. He witnessed the power of faith, not as a rigid doctrine, but as a source of strength and resilience. He saw the unwavering love of God, a love that transcended illness and suffering. He observed the way the Reverend spoke to Thomas, not about the illness or the prognosis, but about the simple joys of life, the beauty of nature, the wonder of childhood, the power of hope. He spoke of faith, not as a rigid set of rules, but as a source of strength and comfort. He spoke of the unwavering love of God, a love that transcended illness and suffering. The Reverend's presence in the hospital room wasn't just a physical presence. It was a powerful spiritual force, a calming influence that eased the tension and anxiety that had filled the room. He didn't preach or judge. He simply offered comfort and support, his empathy bridging the gap created by past misunderstandings. Mr. Abernathy found himself deeply affected by the Reverend's selfless act of kindness. He had expected condemnation, rejection, perhaps even scorn. Instead, he received empathy, understanding, and a profound demonstration of compassion. The Reverend's actions challenged his preconceived notions, his ingrained prejudices, shaking the very foundation of his worldview. He reflected on his own actions, his unfounded accusations, his prejudiced assumptions. He realized the depth of his own bias, the way it had clouded his judgment, the way it had led him to act in a manner that was both unjust and unkind. He felt a deep sense of shame and regret, a profound remorse for his actions. He watched as the Reverend prayed for his son's healing, his voice soft yet powerful, his words filled with genuine compassion and faith. He felt the sincerity of the prayer, the unwavering belief in the power of hope and healing. He realized that his own prejudices had blinded him to the goodness and compassion of others. The Reverend's visit wasn't just a visit. It was a transformative experience. It was a turning point, a moment of profound revelation that challenged his deeply held beliefs and opened his heart to the possibility of change. He had witnessed firsthand the power of faith, the strength of compassion, and the transformative potential of selfless kindness. He had been shown a different way, a way of seeing the world that was free from prejudice and filled with empathy and understanding. The Reverend's visit was a gift of compassion, a gift of understanding, a gift of hope. It was a gift that would change his life forever. The Reverend's visit acted as a catalyst, triggering a profound shift in Mr. Abernathy's perspective. The quiet compassion, the selfless act of kindness, the unwavering faith. It all challenged his deeply ingrained prejudices, forcing him to confront the flaws in his own worldview. He couldn't simply dismiss the experience. It had struck a chord deep within his soul, prompting a long, overdue self-reflection. He found himself replaying the encounter in his mind, each iteration revealing new layers of meaning. He saw the absurdity of his accusations, the baselessness of his suspicions. He realized how his own biases had distorted his perception of reality, leading him to misinterpret innocent actions as evidence of nefarious intent. He had judged a man based on his race, his skin color, his perceived difference. He had allowed his fears and prejudices to cloud his judgment, leading him to act in a manner that was both unjust and unkind. The shame of his actions weighed heavily on him. He felt a deep sense of regret, a profound remorse for the harm he had caused. He had not only wrongly accused an innocent man, but he had also demonstrated a profound lack of empathy and understanding. His actions had been fueled by fear and ignorance, a testament to the destructive power of prejudice. He began to question his own beliefs, his own values. He realized how his rigid worldview had limited his understanding of others, how his adherence to outdated notions had prevented him from seeing the world with open eyes and an open heart. He had lived his life in a self-constructed bubble, a world defined by order and predictability, a world that excluded those who didn't fit neatly into his narrow framework. He started to examine his own life, his own relationships. He saw how his prejudices had affected his interactions with others, how his assumptions had created barriers and misunderstandings. He realized the harm he had inflicted, not only on Reverend James, but also on himself and his family. His rigid worldview had isolated him, preventing him from forming genuine connections with those who were different from him. He began to understand the importance of empathy, the need to see the world from another's perspective. He realized that judging others based on superficial characteristics was not only unfair, but also profoundly inaccurate. He understood that diversity was a strength, not a weakness, and that embracing difference was essential for building a strong and vibrant community. The encounter with Reverend James wasn't just a turning point. It was a transformative experience. It was a moment of profound revelation that challenged his deeply held beliefs and opened his heart to the possibility of change. He realized that his prejudices had not only harmed others, but had also limited his own understanding of the world. He resolved to overcome his biases, to embrace diversity, and to build a more just and compassionate community. The seeds of change had been sown, and he was ready to cultivate them. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas's condition slowly improved. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, and Mr. Abernathy, though still anxious, felt a growing sense of relief. The weight of his guilt, however, remained. He couldn't shake the memory of his unfounded accusations, the shame of his prejudiced actions. The Reverend's visit, his quiet compassion, his unwavering faith, it all weighed heavily on his conscience. He knew he had to do something to make amends for his past behavior. He couldn't simply ignore the incident. He had to confront his actions, to acknowledge his wrongdoing, to seek forgiveness. He knew that an apology wouldn't erase the past, but it would be a step towards healing, both for himself and for Reverend James. He decided to seek out Reverend James to offer a sincere apology for his actions. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He anticipated a mixture of anger, disappointment, perhaps even rejection. But he felt compelled to act, to demonstrate his remorse, to show that he had truly changed. He found Reverend James at the church, a place he had previously avoided, a place that represented everything he had once dismissed or misunderstood. He approached him hesitantly, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation, a blend of fear and hope. He began by expressing his gratitude for the Reverend's visit to the hospital, acknowledging the profound impact it had on him and his family. He spoke of the Reverend's compassion, his unwavering faith, his selfless act of kindness. He expressed his admiration for the Reverend's character, his commitment to his community, his unwavering belief in the power of hope and healing. He then confessed his wrongdoing, acknowledging the baselessness of his accusations, the prejudice that had fueled his actions. He admitted his error, his misjudgment, his lack of empathy. He spoke of his regret, his remorse, his deep sense of shame. He didn't make excuses or try to justify his behavior. He simply accepted responsibility for his actions. His voice trembled as he spoke, his words filled with sincerity and humility. He didn't expect forgiveness. He simply wanted to express his remorse, to acknowledge the harm he had caused, to demonstrate his commitment to change. He spoke from the heart, his words raw and honest, revealing the depth of his regret and the sincerity of his apology. Reverend James listened patiently, his expression calm and understanding. He didn't interrupt or judge. He simply listened, allowing Mr. Abernathy to express his remorse. He understood the weight of the apology, the sincerity of Mr. Abernathy's regret. He saw the transformation that had taken place, the shift in perspective, the genuine desire for change. When Mr. Abernathy finished, Reverend James offered a simple yet profound response. He acknowledged Mr. Abernathy's apology, expressing his acceptance and understanding. He spoke of the importance of forgiveness, the power of redemption, the transformative potential of change. He didn't condone Mr. Abernathy's actions, but he recognized the sincerity of his remorse and the genuine desire for growth. He offered a hand of friendship, a gesture of reconciliation, a symbol of hope and healing. The apology was accepted, the first step towards a renewed understanding and a more compassionate community. The following Sunday, Mr. Abernathy did something he never thought he would do. He went to church, not his own church, a quiet, nondescript building where he'd always felt comfortable in its familiar order, but Reverend James Church, a vibrant, bustling place filled with energy and faith. He had previously avoided this church, a place he associated with otherness, with people who were different from him. His prejudice had created a barrier, preventing him from seeing the beauty and strength of this community. He felt a mix of apprehension and anticipation as he entered the building. He wasn't sure what to expect. He wasn't even sure why he was there. But he felt a pull, a deep-seated need to connect with this community, to participate in their shared faith, to find solace and understanding. The church was alive with energy. The air hummed with the sounds of singing, the rhythmic clapping, the joyful expressions on people's faces. He found a seat near the back, feeling somewhat out of place, a stranger in a familiar land. But the warmth of the congregation, the welcoming smiles, the sense of shared purpose, it all began to ease his apprehension. Reverend James' sermon that day focused on forgiveness, on the power of redemption, on the transformative potential of faith. He spoke of the importance of empathy, of understanding, of seeing the world from another's perspective. He spoke of the need to overcome our prejudices, to embrace diversity, to build a more just and compassionate community. Mr. Abernathy listened intently, his heart touched by the Reverend's words. He saw the sincerity in the Reverend's message, the genuine desire to create a more inclusive and welcoming community. He realized that his own prejudices had blinded him to the beauty and strength of this community, to the power of faith and forgiveness. He felt a sense of belonging, a sense of connection he hadn't experienced before. He was no longer an outsider. He was a part of this community, embraced by its warmth and compassion. He felt a profound sense of peace and understanding, a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. After the service, he approached Reverend James, expressing his gratitude for the sermon, for the message of hope and forgiveness. He reaffirmed his apology, his commitment to change, his desire to be a part of this community. Reverend James welcomed him warmly, offering a handshake and a kind smile. Mr. Abernathy continued attending the church, becoming an active member of the community. He participated in outreach programs, volunteered his time, and formed genuine connections with people from all walks of life. He found solace and strength in his newfound faith, a faith that transcended his past prejudices and embraced the beauty of diversity. He learned to see the world from a different perspective, a perspective that valued empathy, understanding, and compassion. He realized that his prejudices had not only harmed others, but had also limited his own understanding of the world. He had found a new sense of purpose, a renewed sense of community, and a profound appreciation for the power of faith and forgiveness. His life had been transformed, his heart open to the possibility of a more just and compassionate world. The church, once a place he avoided, had become his sanctuary, a place of solace, understanding, and renewed faith. He had found his place, not just in a church, but in a community that had embraced him despite his past mistakes, a community that had shown him the true meaning of faith and forgiveness.